Before we jump into the chaos, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next adventure. The Galactic Military Academy's amphitheater held exactly 200 cadets that morning, representing 47 different species from across the Federation. Commander Alunara stood at the central podium, her four Kravic arms gesturing elegantly as she walked the class through comparative military histories. She had conquered the Bleeding Nebula. She had led fleets through dimensional rifts. Teaching history to cadets should have been the easy part of her career. She was wrong. The lecture had been proceeding normally, covering how various species approached warfare before achieving spaceflight capability. The Zelnari had developed aerial bombardment strategies utilizing their natural flight. The Forvath had created mathematical models for troop deployment that still influenced modern tactics. The Kravic had perfected multi-limbed combat. Every species had their specialty, their contribution to the Federation's collective military knowledge. Then Alunara made the mistake of pulling up the human section of her presentation. The file was remarkably thin. Humans had been model soldiers for generations since joining the interstellar community. Performance reviews were consistently excellent, but when it came to Earth's pre-contact military history, the database contained almost nothing. A few vague references to tribal conflicts, and then a mysterious gap labeled "Records sealed by mutual agreement between Earth government and Federation Council." Alunara found this peculiar. Every other species had extensive documentation of their martial development. The Kravic database alone contained over 2 million detailed battle analyses. Even peaceful species had documentation of their ancient defense strategies. But humanity, a species known for documenting everything, apparently had almost no public military records. So Alunara did what any curious academic would do. She asked about it. "Cadet Trevor," she called out, her voice echoing across the amphitheater. The human exchange student looked up from his datapad with a friendly smile. "Perhaps you could enlighten us about Earth's military historical development. Your species has been notably private about combat records." The smile vanished from Trevor's face so quickly it was like watching a light extinguish. His skin drained to a pale shade that indicated shock or fear in his species. His hands began trembling noticeably. The entire amphitheater went silent. 200 cadets from 47 species all turned to stare at the human who had suddenly transformed from cheerful to terrified. Trevor's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to discuss that topic." Alunara's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Cadet, this is an academic environment. We're simply discussing historical combat development. Surely Earth's pre-contact warfare isn't classified information." Trevor's eyes went wide, and he gripped the edges of his desk until his knuckles turned white. "Commander, please. I really can't answer questions about human combat history. It's above my clearance level, way above. Please don't file a formal inquiry." Before Alunara could respond, her podium lit up with an alert she had never seen before. Red text flashed across her instructor interface. "Classification breach detected. Omega Protocol engaged. Stand by for enforcement response." Omega Protocol? In 8 decades of military service, Alunara had never even heard of an Omega-level classification. The amphitheater's main doors burst open. 4 figures in matte black armor materialized in the aisles. Not walked in, but materialized as if transported directly, using technology that violated Federation regulations on unsanctioned teleportation. The figures moved with mechanical precision toward Trevor's seat. The human cadet didn't resist. He simply stood up, keeping his hands visible, as if trained for exactly this scenario. One of the armored figures spoke in a flat, synthesized voice. "Cadet Trevor, you are being temporarily removed from class for debriefing regarding potential security exposure. This is not disciplinary action. Please come with us." Trevor nodded once and walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, he glanced back at Alunara with an expression that was equal parts apology and warning. Then he was gone, and the doors sealed behind him with a definitive clang. Alunara stood frozen at her podium. "Class dismissed," she managed to say. "We'll resume curriculum tomorrow." The cadets filed out in unusual silence. When the amphitheater was finally empty, Alunara returned to her private office. Her mind raced through possibilities, none making sense. She had simply asked a historical question: what kind of information required armed security response within seconds? She sat at her desk and activated her personal terminal. As a decorated commander, she possessed clearances granting access to most Federation military databases. Surely she could find basic information about Earth's military development. She typed Earth military history into the search interface and pressed enter. The terminal accepted her query. A loading symbol appeared, spinning for 1 second, then another, then a full 5 seconds. Her terminal usually accessed databases instantaneously. Then her screen went black. Not normal shutdown black, but the absolute black of a forcibly terminated system. Before she could reach for manual restart, every other electronic device in her office simultaneously deactivated. Her backup terminal, her data pad, her communication panel, even the lighting controls all went dark in perfect unison. The only illumination came from afternoon sun filtering through her window. Alunara felt her combat instincts activate. Something was very wrong. Then, in the center of her dark office, light began to coalesce. The light resolved into the image of a human woman wearing tactical armor that looked far too advanced for standard Federation issue. The woman held a steaming mug and regarded Alunara with infinite, exhausted patience. "Commander Alunara," the woman said, "my name is Sydney. I'm with Human Classification Enforcement. I'm required to inform you that you have just attempted to access information classified at Omega level by mutual agreement between Earth Government and the Federation Council." Alunara found her voice. "I asked a historical question in an academic setting. Since when does military history require this level of security?" Sydney took a long sip from her mug before answering. "Commander, I'm going to be direct because I respect your service record. The information you're trying to access is classified not because it's sensitive. It's classified because once you learn it, you cannot unlearn it. And based on extensive psychological research, most non-human personnel who gain full knowledge of human combat history experience significant trauma that negatively impacts their ability to serve effectively." Alunara's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "That's absurd. I've studied warfare across hundreds of species spanning thousands of years. What could humanity possibly have done that's worse than anything else in galactic history?" Sydney's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Sympathy, maybe. Or pity. "It's not about what we did, Commander. It's about how good we became at doing it." She set down her mug. "Continued inquiry requires you to sign 42 legal waivers, undergo mandatory psychological evaluation, and accept permanent monitoring. Additionally, you will acknowledge in writing that viewing this information will fundamentally alter your perception of human species capabilities and may impact your professional relationships with human colleagues. I just want to understand why a simple historical question caused such an extreme reaction." "I know," Sydney said, sympathetically. "But the classification exists for good reasons: political stability, diplomatic relations, mental health of reviewing personnel, and most importantly, maintaining the current operational framework where humans serve as regular integrated members of Federation military forces rather than being segregated into specialized roles." Before Alunara could ask what that meant, Sydney's hologram flickered. "I'm receiving notification that you're planning to continue your inquiry despite this warning. Commander, please reconsider. The information you're seeking will not bring satisfaction or enlightenment. It will only bring questions you won't want answered and knowledge you'll wish you could forget." "That's my decision to make," Alunara said firmly. Sydney closed her eyes, then nodded slowly. "Yes, it is. But I am required to tell you there are consequences for accessing Omega classified materials without proper authorization. Career consequences, psychological consequences. And in some cases, memory suppression may be recommended for your own well-being and operational security." The hologram began to fade. "Final warning, Commander. Let this go. Trust me when I say ignorance is genuinely better." Then she was gone. Alunara sat motionless, her mind working through everything. The fear in Trevor's eyes. The immediate security response. the mysterious classification level. And most disturbing, the suggestion that knowing about human combat history could cause psychological trauma to experienced military officers. Her primary computer terminal suddenly sparked, then began smoking. Alunara jumped back as the device literally melted, its components fusing together into slag. The destruction was so complete and targeted that she knew immediately it wasn't an accident. Someone had remotely destroyed her terminal to ensure she couldn't attempt another search. As the smoke cleared, Alunara noticed something on her desk that hadn't been there before. A small printed card. She picked it up carefully. For retirement planning assistance and psychological counseling services, please contact Federation Personnel Management immediately. Your well-being matters to us. The implication was clear. Stop asking questions, or accept that her career and possibly her mental health were at risk. But Alunara was a Kravik warrior. Her people had a saying, curiosity conquered the nebula. The idea of willful ignorance went against every aspect of her cultural upbringing and personal philosophy. She would find answers, but she would need help. Alunara made her way to the staff cafeteria. She immediately spotted the colleagues she was looking for. Odrina, a Zelnari war historian with brilliant azure plumage, sat at a corner table reviewing a datapad. Her species had natural wings and was considered one of the foremost experts on pre-spaceflight warfare patterns. Rylith, a Forvath tactical analyst with angular features and compound eyes, occupied a seat nearby. His species resembled what humans called mantises. Rylith spent his free time creating mathematical models of historical battles. And Julius, a human adjunct professor who taught comparative xenoanthropology, sat with them looking remarkably uncomfortable. Alunara approached their table and sat down without preamble. I need to show you all something. She produced the physical card and placed it in the center of the table. Her colleagues leaned in to read it. Odrina's feathers ruffled in confusion, Rylith's mandibles clicked, and Julius went absolutely pale. Alunara, Julius said slowly. Where did you get this? She explained everything. The question she'd asked Trevor, the security response, the holographic warning from Sydney, the destroyed computer terminal. Odrina laughed. This is clearly human information paranoia taken to absurd extremes. What combat history could possibly justify this level of security theater? Rylith nodded agreement. Humans are competent. Soldiers, certainly, but nothing in their observed capabilities suggests they possess military knowledge so revolutionary. This seems like bureaucratic overreach. But Julius wasn't laughing. His expression had transformed into something Alunara couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but also resignation. Julius, Alunara said carefully, you're human. Why is this information so heavily protected? Julius was silent for a long moment. Finally, he looked directly at Alunara. Did you submit a formal archive request for complete human combat records? Yes, Alunara admitted, before my terminal was destroyed. Julius closed his eyes like someone receiving devastating medical news. When he opened them again, his expression had changed to acceptance of inevitable doom. Then we have very limited time before classification enforcement arrives, with memory suppression equipment and legal documentation. Memory suppression? Odrina's voice rose. That's a violation of academic freedom. It's standard protocol for Omega-level exposure, Julius said flatly. I'm risking my career and possibly my freedom by talking to you right now. But if you want answers, real answers about why humans don't discuss combat history, I'll give them to you. Just understand that once you know, you can't unknow, and you might genuinely wish you'd never asked. The cafeteria had gone quiet. Other faculty members were quickly gathering their belongings and leaving. Tell us, Alunara said firmly. Julius pulled out his personal datapad. If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. But first I need you all to understand something fundamental about human psychology. We don't hide our combat history because we're ashamed of losing. We hide it because we're ashamed of how good we became at winning. Every exit in the cafeteria suddenly locked with a pneumatic hiss that sounded exactly like a tomb sealing shut. Julius worked quickly on his datapad, his fingers moving with the practiced speed. of someone who had prepared for this exact scenario. The locked cafeteria felt smaller now, more confined, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the small group of instructors. Alunara watched as the human professor pulled up a holographic display that projected into the air above their table, showing a timeline that stretched back thousands of years. "Every species in the Federation has warfare in its past," Julius began, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his posture. "The Kravik perfected multi-limbed combat techniques. The Zelnari developed aerial superiority tactics. The Forvath created mathematical optimization for resource allocation during conflicts. All of this is documented, studied, and integrated into modern military doctrine." He expanded the timeline, and Earth appeared as a small blue sphere with red markers scattered across its surface like a disease spreading through healthy tissue. Humanity had all of that too. But we had something else, something that made us fundamentally different from every other species the Federation has encountered. Audrina leaned forward, her azure feathers rustling with curiosity. What could possibly make human warfare so unique that it requires this level of classification? Julius met her eyes with an expression that made Alunara's combat instincts flare with warning. "We never stopped innovating. Every other species in this room represents a civilization that developed effective weapons, reached a certain level of lethality, and then plateaued. You found what worked and maintained it. But humans kept refining, kept optimizing, kept finding new ways to kill each other with increasing efficiency for over 12,000 years without pause." He pulled up a graph comparing military innovation rates across multiple species. Most showed initial sharp increases, followed by long, flat periods of stability. Earth's line climbed steadily upward in an almost vertical trajectory that never leveled off. Most species developed swords, then bows, then eventually firearms, and then stopped for centuries while those weapons reached maturity. Humans developed firearms and immediately began iterating. We created dozens of different ammunition types. We designed weapons for specific tactical scenarios. We built entire scientific disciplines around ballistics, metallurgy, and chemistry purely to make our weapons more lethal. Rylith's compound eyes reflected the holographic data as his analytical mind processed the implications. But surely all military forces seek to improve their capabilities. That's standard strategic thinking. Standard, yes, Julius agreed, but the scale is what matters. Let me show you something specific. He pulled up a file labeled Psychological Warfare Documentation, and the hologram shifted to display what looked like an academic archive. This is a collection of human research into psychological operations. It spans 8,000 years and contains over 347 distinct methodologies for breaking enemy morale without firing a single shot. We studied how sound affects fear responses and weaponized it. We researched color psychology and used it to design uniforms that would intimidate opponents. We even weaponized music. Audrina's beak opened slightly in disbelief. "You weaponized art?" "We weaponized everything," Julius said quietly. "Human military academies don't just teach history, we simulate it. Full neural immersion recreations of every major battle in our history, running millions of iterations with students controlling both sides. We optimize tactics that were already successful and find ways to make them even more efficient. We take historical defeats and replay them until we discover how to turn them into victories." He loaded another file, and the holographic display shifted to show a simulation scenario. This is one example, a major amphibious assault from our pre-spaceflight era. The original battle took months to plan and resulted in thousands of casualties. In modern military academies, we've run this scenario so many times that cadets can now execute the same operation with almost zero attacking casualties because we've refined every variable through endless iteration. Alunara felt something cold settling in her chest. "How many iterations are we discussing?" Julius checked his datapad. For that particular battle, somewhere around 89,000 documented simulation runs, and that's just one battle. We've done this for every significant military engagement in human history. The silence that followed was profound. Even the ambient environmental systems seemed to have gone quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Rylith finally spoke, his mandibles clicking rapidly in a pattern Alunara recognized as extreme cognitive stress. That would represent more accumulated tactical experience than the entire Federation military has acquired in recorded history. Yes, Julius confirmed simply. Audrina's feathers had gone flat against her body, a defensive posture Alunara had never seen the normally confident historian display. But you're peaceful now. Earth hasn't had internal conflicts for generations. You've been model Federation citizens. The expression that crossed Julius's face was something between grief and shame. He pulled up one final image, a simple text document that contained a single sentence. The final global conflict lasted 9 hours before simultaneous cessation of all hostilities. We didn't stop fighting because we became enlightened or evolved beyond violence, Julius explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We stopped because we got too good at it. Every nation's strategic computer systems simultaneously calculated that continuing warfare would result in species extinction with near-perfect certainty. The probability models showed that nobody could win because we'd become so efficient at killing that. Mutual destruction wasn't just likely, it was mathematically inevitable. He closed the holographic display, and the cafeteria seemed darker without its glow. We don't boast about combat because we're ashamed. We perfected the art of war to the point where practicing it became suicidal. So we classify it, we hide it, and we pretend to be normal soldiers in the Federation military because the alternative is admitting what we really are. Before anyone could respond, the cafeteria's main doors exploded inward with a blast of compressed air. 2 figures in advanced tactical armor materialized in the doorway, and Alunara recognized one of them immediately. Sydney, the human enforcement agent from the hologram, now physically present and looking significantly less patient than before. Professor Julius, Sydney said with forced calm, you have violated approximately 17 different security protocols in the last several minutes. Please step away from the civilians. Julius stood, slowly, raising his hands in surrender. But before he moved, he looked at Alunara one last time. I'm sorry, you deserve to know the truth. But now you understand why we keep it classified. Sydney entered the cafeteria with the controlled precision of someone who had performed this exact intervention too many times to feel anything but exhausted resignation. Her partner Omar followed behind her, his tactical armor somehow absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. Both humans moved with an efficiency that made Alunara's warrior instincts recognize them as apex predators despite their relatively small physical stature. Professor Julius, Sydney said again, her tone carrying the weight of official authority. You know the protocol. Please step aside so we can address the situation with minimal disruption. Julius moved away from the table where Alunara, Audrina, and Rylith sat frozen in various states of shock. The human professor's expression carried defeat, but also a strange sense of relief, as if he had been waiting for this confrontation and was almost glad it had finally arrived. Sydney turned her attention to the 3 alien instructors, her eyes scanning each of them with an assessment that felt invasive. Commander Alunara, Historian Audrina, Analyst Rylith, you have all been exposed to Omega-classified information regarding human military capabilities and historical combat doctrine. Under Federation Security Agreement, this exposure requires immediate remediation. Alunara found her voice, though it came out more defensive than she intended. We have a right to information in an academic context. This is a military academy. We teach warfare history to cadets from every species. You do, Sydney agreed calmly, and every species shares their military history openly, because their combat capabilities fall within acceptable parameters for integrated Federation forces. Humanity is an outlier, and that outlier status is classified for reasons that extend beyond simple embarrassment. Omar stepped forward, holding what looked like a datapad but with technology that seemed far too advanced for standard Federation equipment. You now have several options available to you. First option is voluntary memory suppression. We will remove your recollection of this conversation and the information Julius shared. You will retain all other memories intact. This is the recommended course of action. Audrina's feathers puffed up in outrage. Absolutely not. You cannot simply erase our memories because we learned something inconvenient to your security theater. Second option. Omar continued, as if she hadn't spoken, is immediate retirement from Federation military service with full pension and benefits. You would sign non-disclosure agreements and relocate to civilian positions where your knowledge of human combat capabilities poses no operational security risk. Rylith's mandibles clicked rapidly. And the other option? Sydney's expression shifted slightly, showing something that might have been sympathy. Clearance upgrade to Omega level with full access to human military archives. This requires extensive psychological evaluation, permanent monitoring of your communications and activities, and mandatory counseling sessions. It also means accepting that your perception of human colleagues and humanity's role in the Federation will be fundamentally and irreversibly altered. Before anyone could respond, Omar laughed. Not a pleasant sound, but the bitter amusement of someone who had watched others make terrible decisions. Nobody ever chooses the clearance upgrade and stays functional. Last person who requested full access spent the evaluation crying in a corner after the abbreviated briefing. Alunara's combat pride refused to accept this challenge unanswered. I am a decorated Kravik commander. I have led forces through situations that would break most beings. I can handle whatever information you believe is so traumatic. Sydney and Omar exchanged a look that communicated volumes without words. Finally, Sydney nodded slowly. Very well, Commander. We'll process your clearance upgrade request, but understand that we're doing this against our recommendation and judgment. She produced a datapad and handed it to Alunara. This waiver acknowledges that you are voluntarily requesting access to classified human combat documentation despite explicit warnings about psychological impact. Sign here, here, and initial every page. Alunara took the datapad and began scrolling through the document. The legal language was dense and ominous, filled with phrases like permanent psychological modification, irreversible knowledge burden, and accepted risk of operational incapacitation. She signed anyway, her Kravik pride refusing to back down from a challenge. Sydney retrieved the signed datapad and pulled out a neural interface device that looked disturbingly medical. This contains the condensed overview. Just the major developments from human military history over the past several thousand years. It's the shortest briefing we offer, covering only the most significant innovations. Alunara took the device and placed it on her head. The interface activated with a soft hum, and suddenly her mind was flooded with information. Images, tactical analyses, weapon specifications, psychological warfare methodologies, all pouring into her consciousness faster than she could consciously process. She saw simulation data from millions of battle recreations. She witnessed the evolution of human weapons, from primitive clubs to devices that could theoretically crack planets. She experienced the cold mathematical precision with which humans had optimized every aspect of warfare. And then she saw the specific battles, not from a historical perspective, but from the optimized tactical frameworks that human military academies had developed through endless iteration. She saw how humans would have approached the Bleeding Nebula campaign that had earned her greatest glory. The comparison was devastating. What had taken her months of careful planning and cost hundreds of lives, human doctrine could have accomplished in days with almost zero casualties. The interface disconnected, and Alunara found herself trembling. Her 4 hands gripped the edge of the table so hard the metal began to deform under her strength. Tears she didn't remember crying had left damp tracks down her face. You weaponized diseases, she whispered, her voice hollow. You deliberately created plagues designed to target specific genetic markers. You built weapons that could induce mass psychological breaks. You developed strategies to turn civilian populations against their own governments through carefully orchestrated trauma. Sydney's expression remained neutral professional, but her eyes showed genuine regret. Yes, we did all of that and more. Do you understand now why we classify this to get information? Alunara couldn't respond. Her mind kept returning to the tactical comparison of the Bleeding Nebula. Her greatest military achievement, the operation that had defined her career, reduced to a case study in inefficiency compared to human optimization. Every decision she had made, every tactical choice she had been proud of, had been suboptimal. Humans could have done it better, faster, with fewer casualties, and the only reason humans hadn't been asked to lead the operation was because nobody knew what humans were actually capable of achieving. Odrina and Rylith watched their colleague with growing horror, seeing the psychological impact play out in real time. The confident, decorated commander who had entered the cafeteria had been replaced by someone who looked fundamentally broken. "I want the memory suppression," Alunara said quietly. Sydney nodded with understanding rather than triumph. "That's the choice most people make after seeing the briefing. We'll begin the procedure immediately." The memory suppression procedure took place in a secure medical facility beneath the academy that Alunara had never known existed. The room was sterile white, filled with equipment that hummed with power signatures she couldn't identify. Sydney supervised the process personally, while Omar stood guard at the sealed entrance, ensuring no interruptions would compromise the delicate neural work being performed. Alunara sat in a reclined medical chair that adjusted automatically to accommodate her Kravic physiology. A human technician named Elisha worked with practiced efficiency, attaching monitoring devices to Alunara's temples and the base of her skull where her primary neural clusters resided. The technician's hands were steady, her expression professionally detached, as if erasing memories was simply another routine task in her workload. "The process is completely painless," Elisha explained as she calibrated the equipment. "You'll experience some disorientation immediately afterward, similar to waking from deep sleep. Your memory of the past several hours will be replaced with a constructed narrative that fits the timeline without contradictions. You'll remember having a discussion with colleagues about academic matters, feeling tired, and deciding to rest in the faculty lounge. Nothing traumatic, nothing suspicious." Alunara watched the technician work and felt a strange mixture of relief and loss. Part of her warrior spirit rebelled against voluntary ignorance, against choosing not to know something simply because the knowledge was painful. But the larger part of her, the part that had experienced the full weight of human military capability through that neural interface, understood with perfect clarity why this classification existed. She had seen the truth. Humans weren't just good at warfare. Humans had transcended warfare, had evolved it into something approaching art or science or religion, had devoted such enormous cultural resources to perfecting violence that the resulting capability exceeded anything the Federation had ever encountered. And humans hid this capability not out of shame for what humans had done, but out of shame for what humans had become. "I have a question before we proceed," Alunara said quietly. "The battle simulations Julius showed us, the millions of iterations optimizing historical engagements, are humans still running those simulations, still refining tactics for wars that ended centuries ago?" Sydney considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes. Every military academy on Earth continues running tactical simulations as part of cadet training. The official justification is historical education and strategic thinking development. The actual reason is that we need to keep those skills sharp, keep that knowledge accessible, in case the Federation ever faces an existential threat that requires human military doctrine at full capability." "Has that ever happened?" Alunara asked. "Has humanity ever deployed at full combat efficiency since joining the Federation?" The silence that followed her question stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Sydney spoke with careful precision. "That information remains classified above your current clearance level. Even with memory suppression, I cannot discuss operational deployments. But I can tell you that the classification protocols exist to maintain diplomatic stability and prevent certain member species from demanding human military dominance in Federation defense planning." Alunara understood the implication. Humans had deployed at full capability. Somewhere, at some point, the Federation had faced a threat severe enough to require humanity's true military potential. And whatever had happened during that deployment had reinforced the decision to keep human combat doctrine classified at the highest levels. "I'm ready," Alunara said, settling back into the medical chair. Elisha activated the neural interface, and Alunara felt a gentle tingling sensation as the device began mapping her recent memories. The process would take time, carefully identifying and isolating the specific neural patterns associated with the past hours while preserving everything else intact. It was delicate work, requiring precision that only advanced human medical technology could achieve. As the device worked, Alunara found her thoughts drifting to Trevor, the human cadet whose innocent terror had started this entire cascade of events. She wondered how many times Trevor had been through similar debriefings, how many times someone had asked him about Earth's combat history and triggered security protocols. She wondered what it felt like to carry knowledge so dangerous that simply discussing it could derail careers and compromise diplomatic relationships. The suppression process accelerated, and Alunara felt her memories beginning to blur at the edges. The last coherent thought she had before. Losing consciousness was a realization that humans lived with this burden constantly. Every human in the Federation carried the knowledge of what their species had accomplished, what their ancestors had perfected, and chose every single day to suppress that capability in service of peaceful coexistence. It was perhaps the most impressive demonstration of restraint Alunara had ever encountered. Then the suppression completed, and Commander Alunara forgot she had ever learned the truth about human warfare. Alunara woke slowly, her mind foggy with the disorientation Elisha had warned about. She was lying on a comfortable couch in the faculty lounge, afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Her chronometer indicated she had been unconscious for approximately half an hour, though she had no memory of falling asleep. Must have been more tired than she realized after teaching that morning lecture. She sat up carefully, her forearms stretching as she worked out the stiffness from her awkward sleeping position. Audrina sat nearby, reading a datapad and occasionally glancing up to check on Alunara with concerned eyes. "Feeling better?" the Zelnari historian asked. "You seemed exhausted during our discussion earlier. I suggested you rest before your afternoon commitments." Alunara's memory supplied the context smoothly. She had been discussing curriculum development with Audrina and Rylith, comparing different approaches to teaching military history. The conversation had been pleasant but intellectually demanding, and Alunara had felt fatigue creeping in afterward. Nothing unusual, just the normal tiredness that came with a busy academic schedule. "Much better, thank you," Alunara replied, standing and straightening her uniform. "I should return to my office and prepare for tomorrow's classes." She left the lounge and walked through the academy's corridors with the comfortable familiarity of routine. Students passed her in small groups, chattering about assignments and social plans. Everything felt normal, peaceful, exactly as it should be in an institution dedicated to education and knowledge. When Alunara reached her office, she noticed her primary computer terminal had been replaced with a newer model. A maintenance notice on her desk explained that the old unit had experienced a hardware failure and been upgraded as part of routine technical support. She appreciated the efficiency of the Academy's technical staff, handling the replacement without requiring her direct involvement. Alunara settled into her desk and began reviewing her lesson plans for the next morning. The curriculum covered comparative military histories, a fascinating subject that highlighted how different species approached warfare based on their unique physiologies and cultural values. She reached the section on human military development and found the usual sparse documentation. Humans maintained relatively private records about their pre-contact warfare, which she attributed to cultural preferences about discussing violent history. Some species celebrated their martial heritage openly. Others preferred discretion. Humans apparently fell into the latter category, and Alunara respected that choice. After all, every culture had the right to present their history in whatever manner felt appropriate to their values. As she worked, Alunara noticed Julius passing by her open office door. The human professor paused, glanced inside, and their eyes met briefly. Julius gave her a small nod that carried an emotion Alunara couldn't quite identify. Approval, maybe? Or perhaps relief? Before she could consider it further, Julius continued down the corridor and disappeared around a corner. Alunara returned to her lesson planning, already forgetting the momentary interaction. In a secure facility located deep beneath the academy, Sydney completed her incident report with the methodical thoroughness that her position required. The document detailed the security breach, the information exposure, the remediation procedures, and the final outcomes. All three alien instructors had ultimately chosen memory suppression. Julius had received an official reprimand, but no permanent career consequences given his cooperation during the incident resolution. The report concluded with recommendations for future prevention protocols and a notation that this represented the latest in an increasing pattern of classification breaches. Sydney added her professional assessment that the current security framework would eventually fail as more Federation personnel became curious about the discrepancy between observed human military competence and the suspiciously absent historical documentation. Omar entered the office as Sydney was finalizing the report. He carried 2 mugs of the bitter stimulant beverage humans consumed to maintain alertness during long shifts. Sydney accepted one gratefully and took a long drink before speaking. "We can't keep doing this forever," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone fighting an inevitable outcome. "The memory suppressions work, the classifications hold, but the questions keep coming. Eventually, someone will piece together enough indirect evidence to realize humans are operating significantly below actual capability." Omar sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "Command is aware. There are contingency plans for eventual declassification, but the political timing has to be perfect. If we reveal human combat capability too early, before the Federation Council has enough institutional trust in humanity's restraint, the diplomatic fallout could fracture the entire alliance structure. And, if we wait too long," Sydney countered, "and someone discovers the truth independently without proper context, the fallout could be even worse. Imagine if a hostile intelligence service obtained these records and presented them to the Council as evidence that humans have been hiding dangerous capabilities from our own allies." The conversation continued in circles, as it had countless times before during similar post-incident discussions. Both agents understood the impossible position humanity occupied within the Federation. Too capable to hide forever, too frightening to reveal completely, trapped in a perpetual balancing act between secrecy and transparency. Finally, Omar changed the subject to something more immediate. "How did Commander Alunara handle the full briefing before suppression? The report says she made it through the condensed overview." Sydney's expression became thoughtful, better than most, actually. She processed the information, understood the implications, and made a rational decision to undergo suppression without psychological breakdown. The Kravik are warriors by culture. I think part of her recognized and respected what human military development represented, even while being horrified by it. "Will she investigate again after the Makkah?" "Suppression?" Omar asked. "Unlikely," Sydney replied. "The constructed memories include a subconscious association between the topic and negative emotions. Not strong enough to seem like artificial manipulation, just a mild discomfort that will make her naturally avoid pursuing that line of inquiry. She'll move on to other research interests without consciously understanding why." Omar nodded approval at the elegant solution. Humans had become very good at memory suppression over the generations, refining the technique to leave no detectable traces while still influencing future behavior in subtle ways. It was, Sydney reflected with dark irony, exactly the kind of sophisticated psychological manipulation that made human warfare doctrine so terrifying to begin with. "What about Professor Julius?" Omar asked. "He's going to keep having these confrontations. We've reprimanded him before. Eventually we'll need to consider stronger measures." Sydney shook her head firmly. "Julius is a good man trying to do right by his colleagues. He genuinely believes they deserve to know the truth, and from a certain ethical perspective, he's correct. Humans joined the Federation under principles of open cooperation and shared knowledge. Maintaining massive military secrets from our own allies contradicts those principles. But necessary," Omar pointed out. "But necessary," Sydney agreed reluctantly, "which is why Julius receives reprimands instead of prosecution. He serves a valuable function as a pressure relief valve. When classification breaches occur, he provides context that prevents complete panic while still maintaining core security. It's an uncomfortable compromise, but most aspects of human integration into the Federation involve uncomfortable compromises." The conversation wound down as both agents returned to their respective responsibilities. Sydney transmitted her completed incident report through encrypted channels to Federation Security Command, where analysts would review the breach and update statistical models predicting future classification challenges. The response came back within minutes, as it always did. Her report had been received, reviewed, and accepted. No additional action required at this time. Continue monitoring the situation and maintain current security protocols. Sydney closed the communication channel and allowed herself a moment of private frustration. She had joined classification enforcement because she believed in the mission, believed that protecting the secret of human military capability served the greater good of Federation stability. But every incident, every memory suppression, every colleague who came dangerously close to understanding the truth eroded her certainty a little further. Humans had worked so hard to integrate peacefully into galactic civilization. Humans had suppressed their most powerful capabilities in service of diplomacy and cooperation. Humans had chosen restraint over dominance, had accepted subordinate positions in military hierarchies despite possessing vastly superior tactical knowledge, had endured countless small indignities and inefficiencies rather than reveal the full extent of their capabilities. And all of that sacrifice, all of that careful diplomacy, depended on maintaining the classification of information that, by any reasonable standard, should have been shared openly with allies. Sydney understood the necessity. She just wasn't certain how much longer the necessary could be maintained against the inevitable. The following morning, Commander Alunara arrived early for her lecture, energized and prepared after a restful evening. Her class filed in with the usual mixture of enthusiasm and sleepiness characteristic of young cadets. Trevor took his customary seat in the middle section, offering Alunara a friendly smile that she returned automatically. The lecture proceeded smoothly through comparative analysis of military innovations across various pre-spaceflight civilizations. Alunara discussed Zelnari aerial tactics, Forvath logistical optimization, and Kravik close-quarters combat specialization. When she reached the human section of her presentation, she provided the standard overview of territorial conflicts and tribal warfare, before noting that detailed records remained limited due to cultural preferences for privacy regarding violent history. None of the cadets asked for elaboration. The human sections of military history curricula had been deliberately structured to seem complete enough to avoid obvious gaps, while remaining vague enough to prevent dangerous curiosity. It was psychological manipulation applied at the institutional level, another example of the subtle but pervasive techniques that characterized human integration into Federation systems. After class concluded and the students departed, Alunara remained at her podium for a moment, organizing her materials and reflecting on the lecture. Something felt slightly off, though she couldn't identify what specifically troubled her. A vague sense of missing context, perhaps, or an intuition that the standard curriculum glossed over important information. The feeling passed quickly, dismissed as overthinking the material she had taught countless times before. Alunara gathered her belongings and moved toward her next obligation, already mentally preparing for the curriculum committee meeting scheduled that afternoon. She passed Julius in the corridor, and once again the human professor gave her that small nod carrying unidentifiable emotion. This time Alunara paused, curiosity overcoming her schedule urgency. "Professor Julius," she said, catching his attention. "Is there something you wanted to discuss? You've been giving me peculiar looks recently." Julius's expression cycled through several emotions too quickly for Alunara to identify before settling on careful neutrality. "Not at all, Commander. Just acknowledging a respected colleague. I hope your classes are going well?" "Very well, thank you," Alunara replied, though her intuition insisted Julius wasn't being entirely forthcoming. "Have I inadvertently caused some offense? Your behavior suggests concern." "No offense whatsoever," Julius assured her with what seemed like genuine sincerity. "I'm simply glad to see you looking well-rested and focused. You seemed quite tired yesterday, and I was worried you might be overextending yourself with academic responsibilities." The explanation made sense. Alunara had indeed been tired yesterday, enough to fall asleep in the faculty lounge during what should have been productive working hours. Julius was simply expressing friendly concern for a colleague's well-being, nothing more complicated than basic professional courtesy. "I appreciate your consideration," Alunara said warmly. "I've been maintaining better rest schedules, and I feel much improved." Julius smiled, though something in his eyes remained sad despite the positive expression. "Excellent. Please continue taking care of yourself, Commander. Your health and happiness matter to all of us who work alongside you." The interaction ended, and both instructors continued to their respective destinations. Alunara felt satisfied that she had addressed whatever minor social awkwardness had been developing. Julius seemed reassured that she was managing her responsibilities appropriately. Everything returned to the comfortable normalcy of academic routine. Neither of them acknowledged the layers of deception and psychological manipulation underlying their seemingly simple exchange. Neither of them mentioned the classified truths that Julius carried constantly and that Alunara had briefly learned before choosing to forget. Neither of them discussed the fundamental imbalance in their relationship, where one party possessed dangerous knowledge that the other party had deliberately chosen not to remember. It was, in its own way, a perfect encapsulation of humanity's position within the Federation. Smiling, helpful, apparently transparent, while maintaining secrets that would fundamentally alter the political landscape if ever fully revealed. Deep within the classified archives of Federation Security Command, an analyst named Rosalia reviewed the latest statistical projections regarding human military classification sustainability. The models incorporated data from every security incident over the past several generations, tracking patterns in inquiry frequency, breach severity, and remediation effectiveness. The trend lines were unambiguous. Classification breaches were accelerating. Each incident resolution left more people with subconscious awareness that something important remained hidden. The memory suppressions worked, but the resulting vague discomfort with the topic created a population-level curiosity that manifested as increased background investigation by individuals who had never personally encountered the classified information. It was a slow-motion cascade failure, inexorable and probably unstoppable. Eventually, the classification would fail completely, and the Federation Council would learn the truth about human military capabilities. The only question was whether that revelation would occur in a controlled manner with proper context, or explosively through some unpredictable security failure. Rosalia added her analysis to the ongoing strategic planning documents that theoretically prepared for eventual declassification. She knew that senior leadership reviewed these projections regularly, understood the implications, and continued delaying decisive action because no perfect moment for revelation ever arrived. The political calculus was genuinely complex. Reveal too early, and the Federation might fracture from fear of human military dominance. Reveal too late, and the Federation might fracture from betrayal when the deception was uncovered independently. Find the perfect middle timing, and, maybe, possibly, humanity could navigate the disclosure without catastrophic diplomatic consequences. Rosalia suspected that perfect timing didn't exist, that any revelation would cause significant disruption regardless of context. But her job was analysis, not policy. She provided the data, made the recommendations, and accepted that decisions ultimately belonged to individuals with much higher authority and much greater political awareness. She finalized her report and transmitted it through appropriate channels, then moved on to her next analytical task. Somewhere above her clearance level, someone would read her projections and incorporate them into strategic planning, or ignore them entirely, or file them away for future consideration when circumstances changed enough to make action seem feasible. Rosalia had stopped trying to predict what senior leadership would actually do with her work. She simply ensured her analysis remained rigorous and comprehensive, trusting that the good information would be available when needed. That evening, Trevor sat in his dormitory quarters, reviewing his academic performance and planning his remaining time at the Galactic Military Academy. The incident in Commander Alunara's class had been frightening but ultimately manageable. The debriefing had been professional and efficient. The security personnel had treated him with respect, rather than suspicion, acknowledging that he had followed protocols correctly by refusing to answer questions above his clearance level. Still, Trevor couldn't shake the guilt he felt about the entire situation. Commander Alunara was an excellent instructor who genuinely cared about education and knowledge. She had asked a reasonable question in an academic context, and the answer to that reasonable question had triggered security protocols that ended with memory suppression and career warnings. It seemed profoundly wrong that simply asking about military history could cause such drastic consequences. Trevor understood the reasoning behind the classification. understood why humanity's combat capabilities remained secret, but understanding didn't eliminate the moral discomfort. His communication panel activated with an incoming message. Trevor accepted the connection and saw Professor Julius appear on the holographic display, looking tired but concerned. "Cadet Trevor," Julius began without preamble. "I wanted to check on you after yesterday's incident. Are you managing all right? I know these security responses can be stressful." Trevor appreciated the concern. "I'm fine, Professor. Just feeling guilty about the consequences for Commander Alunara. She didn't deserve to have her memories altered just for asking a question." Julius nodded, understanding. "No, she didn't. But unfortunately, the classification protocols don't care about deserving. The information is dangerous in ways that go beyond simple military secrets. Alunara saw the full briefing before choosing suppression. She's understood what she was asking to forget." "Does that make it better?" Trevor asked. "That she chose ignorance after seeing the truth?" "I don't know," Julius admitted, honestly. "I've been asking myself that question for years. Is willing ignorance morally superior to imposed ignorance? Is choosing not to know somehow more ethical than being forced not to know? The philosophy becomes complicated very quickly." Trevor leaned back in his chair, considering the question seriously. "What would you do? If you could go back and choose never to learn about Earth's military history, never to carry that knowledge, would you choose ignorance?" Julius was quiet for a long moment before answering. "No, I wouldn't choose ignorance. Knowing is painful, but not knowing feels like betraying something fundamental about human intellectual heritage. We developed all that capability, refined all that doctrine, perfected all those tactics. Pretending it doesn't exist, hiding from our own history, seems cowardly even when the hiding serves legitimate diplomatic purposes." "But you support the classification," Trevor observed. "You think the secrets should stay secret." "I do," Julius confirmed, "because I understand the consequences of revelation. The Federation isn't ready to know what humanity is capable of. Maybe someday, after enough generations of peaceful cooperation, the revelation won't trigger existential fear. But that day hasn't arrived yet, and forcing the issue prematurely would cause more harm than maintaining the deception." The conversation continued for a while longer before Julius disconnected, leaving Trevor alone with his thoughts. The young cadet considered the strange paradox of human existence within the Federation. Humans had joined galactic civilization genuinely seeking peace and cooperation. Humans had willingly suppressed their most powerful capabilities to avoid intimidating potential allies. Humans had accepted subordinate positions and inefficient tactics rather than reveal the full extent of their military sophistication. And all of that sacrifice, all of that restraint, required maintaining a lie by omission that contradicted the fundamental principles of open knowledge and shared information that supposedly governed Federation relationships. Trevor didn't know how to resolve that contradiction. He suspected nobody knew, which was why the classification continued despite obvious ethical problems. Sometimes there were no good solutions, only choices between different varieties of inadequate compromise. He returned to his studying, pushing the philosophical questions aside in favor of more immediate academic concerns. Whatever larger policy debates might be occurring at levels far above his clearance, Trevor still had assignments to complete and examinations to pass. Commander Alunara finished her evening routine and prepared for sleep, feeling satisfied with her productivity that day. Classes had gone well. Curriculum planning had advanced. Collegial relationships remained strong. Everything functioned smoothly in the comfortable rhythm of academic life. As she settled into her rest chamber, Alunara's last conscious thoughts were about her upcoming lecture on combined arms tactics across different species. It would be fascinating to compare how various physiological advantages influenced military doctrine development. The Kravik's multiple limbs, the Zelnari's flight capability, the Forvath's analytical processing speed, all creating unique approaches to warfare that modern Federation forces attempted to integrate into cohesive strategies. She wondered briefly what unique advantages humans brought to combined arms operations, but the thought slipped away before achieving clarity. Something about adaptability and psychological insight, probably. Humans seemed particularly skilled at understanding how different species thought and felt, making them excellent liaison officers and diplomatic personnel. Alunara drifted towards sleep, unaware that her question about human military advantages had nearly destroyed her career just days earlier. The memory suppression held perfectly, leaving no trace of the knowledge she had briefly possessed. She would never know that humans brought capabilities to warfare so advanced that revealing them would fundamentally alter Federation power dynamics. She would never know that human restraint represented the most impressive military capability of all, the discipline to deliberately operate at a fraction of actual potential for diplomatic purposes. She would never know that the truth about human combat doctrine remained classified not because humans were ashamed of their past, but because the Federation couldn't handle humanity's present. And in her comfortable ignorance, Commander Alunara slept peacefully, dreaming of tactical theories and academic success, while the secret that defined humanity's relationship with the galaxy remained safely buried in classified archives where it belonged. For now, this was just one story. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next.